Hello today folks. Did you know? Our topic today is dissociation. Here are Shiva and Jonathan alias the Matrixer.
Und Jonathan, alias die Matrixer.
Again, so today's topic is dissociation. We have announced it many times and promised you that we will make a video on dissociation. And tada, here it is. We've been dealing with dissociation for a very, very long time. I stumbled upon this many years ago when I was 13, but I had no idea what it really was either. Jonathan is already much more experienced. He has been writing about it in his book since 2004 and had a lot more experience back then. And that's why he's going to explain to you what dissociation actually is. And then we'll talk more about it later. Tell me, Jonathan. Yes, first of all, before you want to learn the technique of dissociation, you should also know what it is about. In psychology, you also know a lot about dissociation, which tends to be demonized and portrayed as negative. On the one hand, however, it is somewhat understandable, because the people who are experiencing problems do not know what is happening to them due to sudden or spontaneous dissociations and then of course run to the psychiatrist or to a psychologist. And then you are in the right place for those who see themselves as victims and want to get rid of it. But I would like to point out that dissociation can also be used constructively. Because if you know what it is about and what is happening there, then you can also learn dissociation in this sense and also use it as a technique to get into higher states of consciousness. The dissociation has to be imagined as stopping the whole thinking apparatus and the imagination. Not forever, but only for a short time, temporarily. As an example, namely, I always take a person that you imagine. Imagine you are looking out the window and you see a man with a car key walking towards a house. And then, of course, you start to associate. Yes, that's exactly what he's doing in the place where he lies. You actually get ideas about it. This is the owner of the car. He's getting in the car now because he's got the keys in his hand. These are all associations that you then associate with what you are currently perceiving. But they don't correspond to reality. Rather, that is an interpretation. Yes, that's an interpretation or a prediction. And in order to predict everyday actions, you need association. That's helpful in everyday life. This is exactly how you can of course assess and plan everyday life. But with dissociation, for me, it's exactly the opposite. Namely that you only look at the action itself, which takes place in the present. And how is it? The person approaches the car and has a key in his hand. We don't know. Maybe it's a thief who wants to steal the car. Maybe he doesn't want to go shopping at all, but drives to work or picks up his child. Or maybe he just wants to get something out of the car. But when you make associations, you notice that you are already calculating the possibilities. One anticipates, although one does not know what is real. Correct. And then you have to understand first of all that dissociation brings us back to the current and immediate present, in that we don't just concentrate on the man having a key and walking towards the car. Not more. Okay. And the dissociation brings you back to the here and now. You know that too with dissociation. You said yes. You once told me that 13 years ago you practiced it very intensively. And what happened there? 13 years ago. I had no idea. I just wanted to stop thinking and practice like crazy every day. Don't think, don't think, don't think. According to Franz Bardon's technique. And at some point it was like this. I couldn't think anymore. Day in, day out. I couldn't think anymore. I can't think anymore. I didn't know what was happening to me at all. And this not thinking somehow led to the accumulation of so much energy that I suddenly had a great insight into the whole universe or the meaning of creation. And that got me so done. I couldn't deal with it at all at the time because I didn't know what it was. What condition is this? What is happening with me? And I had no one to talk to explain what was going on. I've had depression. Then I decided to just forget everything and have had nothing to do with it for over 10 years now. Because that was too much for me at the time. That wasn't a good experience. But in the meantime, if you control it, learn it and tackle it, good conditions come out of it. In any case. So that's a point too. Dissociation is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it is one of the best and quickest techniques to achieve results in the expansion of consciousness. But on the other hand, if you somehow maybe have an unstable personality or you're a bit sensitive or touchy, then it's entirely possible that you feel threatened by it. Or the ego feels threatened because it cannot calculate everyday life at the moment. And the ego always wants to calculate everyday life, every second. If you try to dissociate for even a few minutes, we find that the ego will start boycotting it somehow. That was also very difficult at the beginning, but at some point over time there was suddenly no more ego. There were no more thoughts. It could no longer manipulate you, I would say. Because with dissociation you have to imagine that the thoughts come in and go out again and come back in again. And when you start dissociating, you create a dam. And then suddenly the thoughts don't come in anymore and the energy that goes into thinking builds up, becomes more and more. Because you have to remember that in everyday life you use about 60 to 80% of your psychic energies for thinking. Exactly. I can also give a good example. When I was still studying, I studied all day and lost HB without end. I didn't do any sport because so many were studying. Yes, students most likely know. When they really kneel down in the material, it takes a lot of energy. So definitely. And this dam, when it is created, the energies accumulate. And if you stop dissociating after a certain time, for example, then the dam is opened and all the energy that was backed up comes in and it shifts consciousness into higher states of consciousness. So you can imagine it like that. Yes, when I started dissociating, I slipped into other lives. So I was suddenly Zach in England. Yes, and I was sitting there in my fancy wing chair by the fireplace and I was just like, where am I? What happened here? And of course I was irritated at first. By the way, I've already seen you in the wing chair, in such a state. Yes, and the dissociation is a bit erratic at first. You can suddenly experience memories of other lives or suddenly recognize things that you would normally have completely overlooked in everyday life. So all such effect, but we'll talk about what can happen later. And that's why you should really only use dissociation if you have enough self-confidence. Trust in your higher self is important, because the states that can arise can also sometimes be fears. Fears, for example, that can arise there. And in that case you really have to have faith in your higher self that everything that is happening is correct. Yes. Let's get down to how the situation actually works overall. And there are two ways to dissociate. Once with your eyes open and once with your eyes closed. With your eyes closed, the perception is actually completely different. When you dissociate with your eyes closed and your brain eventually goes into an alpha state, images come to me that are crystal clear. That means my consciousness, it shifts to other places, sometimes other planets. And then I can switch and look at the surroundings or the places or the person. I often see people going about their everyday lives. Or once I saw a Chinese gang of thugs. But you've seen aliens before. I've seen aliens before. I was recently on Mars and saw that my consciousness actually only looks at the surface. But I couldn't look up. I thought, that has to work. I have to be able to look around me with my consciousness. And then suddenly it happened. That is, with the dissociation, with my eyes closed, I can shift my awareness to different points in this or other realities. Also in other worlds. You can also use it to trigger out-of-body experiences or to dream lucidly. Yes, this also works with your eyes closed. Then at some point you just suddenly switch from these images and you are lucid. Yes. Yes. And the dissociation with open eyes is of course a different number, because then everyday life is questioned at that moment. The first beginnings that one experiences there is that other people seem like a spectacle, that the others take part in the spectacle, or that it's all just actors pretending. You know that very well. As if all people were some kind of holograms or some kind of theater actors who only pretend to do what they are doing. Well, in the restaurant, we've often experienced that, or on the street. You know that too. Yes, that's very funny. And if you go even deeper into the dissociation with your eyes open, then it is quite possible that buildings also appear to be scenery. A bit like in that old Hollywood movie, where you see a Western, for example, suddenly just placed somewhere. Yes, just put there and only the front wall exists. So you notice that if you don't associate, then you only recognize the immediate present. Only what really exists, without the associations that you add to it. If you also have to remember, we are creator beings. And with our associations we create reality. And so a scenery becomes a real house. Because we complement it. We are inspired by the scenery, so to speak. And through our association, through our creative power, we make a whole house out of the front wall. What other experiences have you had regarding dissociation? An experience that I will always remember. So my first experience in this direction, which I have experienced more often in the course of my life, was that I was standing at the traffic light with my motorcycle. And I was always dissociating a lot at the time. And the more you dissociate, the easier it is. At some point it becomes easier and then spontaneous dissociations appear, sometimes in situations that are perhaps not always favorable or where one is somehow surprised. And that was the case for me when I was standing at the traffic light and the traffic light was red. And in that moment I dissociated and the whole reality that I saw around me stayed the same. Well, the traffic light didn't turn into a frog, or something. So what not? But everything stayed the same. But still, the feeling of reality was suddenly completely different. As if I were looking behind the scenes of the reality I'm currently perceiving. It wasn't like there was a curtain of any kind either. Or there was something behind it. Just the reality. It was all this, but the people, for example, who were walking around were suddenly no longer quite normal people from everyday life. But all the people who were there was a woman with a pram. There were two young people who were fooling around there, or an older woman who wanted to go through the traffic light. All these people, who are so familiar in everyday life, were suddenly no longer familiar. On the contrary, Then I realized that they had agreed for this individual scene that everyone had a specific task in the scene. For example, the woman with the stroller. I heard that thing. I felt right what she was thinking. And what she thought, above all. And what did she think? She thought I was pretending to be a woman pushing a stroller through the lights. The two teenagers too. I heard them think too. And they thought, yeah, come on, let's pretend we're kidding around. So everyone just pretended. You mean like on The Truman Show? Right, like on The Truman Show. Yes, that's a good movie. Well, when the movie The Truman Show came out, I read, a lot of people who have a little bit of dissociation issues suddenly felt that dissociation had gotten stronger in them. Yes, and that's why it was said in some places that people with dissociative disorders shouldn't watch this film. And then that was recommended. But then why was it recommended? Do you have to think about that? Why is this recommended? Why is this presented as a clinical picture? I mean, on the one hand I can understand it, because many feel like victims of dissociation. They want that gone. But someone who wants to expand their consciousness, really wants to expand it effectively, even in everyday life, can't really avoid dissociation. And maybe each of you knows about dissociative states. If you've ever driven a long distance on the Autobahn, and suddenly, after 100 kilometers, you realize, oops, how did I just get from A to B? How was I able to cover 100 kilometers in a second? It seemed much shorter to me. And boom, yes, it's true when driving a car. You sometimes get into this state. But we do not recommend doing this while driving. So don't practice. Yes, better at home in an armchair, right? For example, I like to do this when I go shopping, because when I'm in the supermarket, everything is so matrix. That makes everything much easier for me. I always think what's going on here can't be true. And then it's easier for me. Or when I'm walking downtown or something or sitting in a cafe. So there are some of my favorite strains where I dissociate. It also works well when you're with people who are all talking to each other and you're kind of outside of the action. You are not involved in the conversation right now. Or sometimes even when we record here, you slide in there real quick. Yes, when the other talks, you listen yourself. Then you stare at the camera and dissociate. Then you can use the time a bit to dissociate. Yes. And that's the point. Well, if you recognize that people are actually part of a play at that moment, and you suddenly have to realize that you are also part of a play yourself. Exactly. Then you also realize that something is wrong with reality. This is a very important experience that you have to have, namely that you realize that something is wrong with reality. And that you realize that something is wrong with yourself. Exactly. One of my experiences with dissociation was that I then realized that everyone who thinks in my head doesn't even exist. That is, the personality is divided into several aspects or consists of all aspects, which in turn are actually only programs. And those are the voices in your head, by the way, which then cause thinking. Suddenly I noticed that the aspect is talking to the aspect, and the aspect is talking to the aspect, and the aspect is talking to the aspect. You hear that and you think these are your thoughts. But somehow those aren't your thoughts at all. And yes, suddenly, you hear yourself talking. And then you realize that you don't register at all. These are just your aspects and a personality trait. Yes, and these personality traits, of course they chatter all day long. You have different roles in everyday life. You just have to learn to distance yourself from it. Then you can see that all your programs are running there. So you play one role in everyday life with your partner, another role with your parents, at work. At work or at the spiritual level. Yes, all roles. Yes. And there you can see that you consist of several roles that you use in everyday life.
Alltag verwendet.
The personality that you get put on and you don't find that funny at all.
Und das ist dann
And that's just it. Those
auch
are the parts that are bubbling away in your head all the time.
die ganze Zeit vor sich hin blubbern, ne? Die ganze Zeit reden und in der
Talk all the time, and in dissociation you learn to distance yourself from these conversations in your head.
und durch diese
And through this distance you get the personality aspects
Aspekte dazu
to shut up and store, increase or decrease energy,
zu speichern beziehungsweise zu stauen.
to stow.
Genau.
Exactly.
Sowas wie
And then something like shifts in reality can occur.
du wahrnimmst,
Or that you perceive that you are actually changing into different realities, or at least that you can perceive the changes.
oder zumindest die Wechsel wahrnehmen kannst. Oder sie nebeneinander sehen kannst.
Or you can see them side by side, the different realities.
Also auf alle Fälle in der
In
ersten
any case,
Stufe der
in the first stage of dissociation. So there are 4 stages in total. In the first stage it is important to recognize this.
wer sich wirklich
If you really want to seriously deal with the expansion of consciousness, you really have to learn dissociation for better or for worse if you really want to go deeper down the rabbit hole.
wenn wirklich da tiefer rein will in den Kaninchenbau und
And
wichtig ist
it is important that you
dass man
recognize that something is wrong with reality and what is wrong with yourself.
was mit sich selbst nicht stimmt. Denn wenn man erkennt, dass alles
Because when you realize that everything is an illusion, you will eventually realize that your own personality is also not real.
und da fängt
And then the search begins for his true self.
sobald man nämlich
As soon as one has recognized, I am not me at all, but if I am not me, then who am I?
wer bin ich dann?
Then who am I? That was also one of my very first questions. If I'm not me, who am I?
Und darum ist das wirklich ein
And so that's really a yes,
ein
a must to keep this realization.
zu erhalten, dass irgendwas mit der Realität
That something is wrong with reality and with your own personality exactly.
Genau. Und
And yes, if you just dissociate during the day, you just learn to perceive the change of reality.
wahrzunehmen.
ja, die Realität
Yes, the reality shifts, the alternate realities
Einen herum
that exist around you.
die beginnt
One begins to perceive this in dissociation.
beim Film, wenn
It's like in a movie when a scene changes.
kann man sich das vorstellen.
Practically, as you can imagine.
sein, dass man
Yes,
auch
you may be able to switch from one scene to another for 10 seconds and then switch back to the normal scene.
in die normale Szene.
Genau.
Sowas zum Beispiel.
For example, or you notice minute changes in everyday life, where something suddenly occurs that somehow doesn't really fit in as an element.
was irgendwie nicht so richtig reinpasst als Element.
Du hast letztens ein gutes Beispiel.
You did the example the other day with the sugar in the cupboard.
Gehst am Schrank.
You go to the cupboard and look for the sugar.
Er steht nicht da. Dann kommst
He's not there, and then you come back later, and suddenly the sugar is there. You can see that the reality has changed.
Weil man könnte natürlich
Because of course you could explain it like this. Yes, you didn't see the sugar.
Du hast den Schrank
Exactly.
aufgemacht,
You opened the closet, looked in, and didn't see the sugar.
hast einen Zuckerwatte.
Then you look for the sugar somewhere else.
Aber so ist es nicht.
But it is not like
Wenn man
that.
den Schrank
If you open the cupboard and you don't see the sugar, then you are in the reality where the sugar is not there.
da gerade nicht steht. Dann macht man den Schrank wieder zu.
Then you close the closet again and then maybe go to another room or search the other closets.
Und wenn man dann wieder zu dem Schrank zurück,
And then when you go back to the closet, it's not the same reality you're in.
in der man sich befindet, sondern macht den Schrank auf und der steht.
Instead, open the cupboard and there is the sugar. For,
Ja, eben, sehr gut.
yes, the example also works with salt, of course,
Oder O-Saft.
or orange juice. Exactly. It doesn't
Muss ja nicht immer Zucker sein.
always have to be sugar.
So, dann möchten wir euch noch natürlich
So,
fragen.
then of course we would like to tell you how does dissociation work.
Ich werde euch
I'm going to tell you a little beginner's technique in Jonathan. Then the dissociation will explain how it really works.
Dissoziation wirklich funktioniert. Aber
But in order to really get into dissociation, you have to learn to stop your thoughts first.
dann